Honorable Martha Chizuma, Mr. Wile Kambwandela, the Executive Director for CSAT, Center for Social Accountability and Transparency, who we have worked with on this report. I recognize the presence of Mr. Daisy Homer, representing DODMA. I also see Mr. Chira, coming from the Ministry of Finance, colleagues from the Office of the Ombudsman, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. It is a very, very good day for us because this report that we have here has taken a toll on us. The COVID and us investigating issues on COVID sounds like an ironic thing. But we are here now. And before we start everything, let us know each other who is here and from the media house that you are representing. Thank you very much. We can start with a gentleman in a black vest.
My name is Steve from Communication Publications.
I'm Mibawa from MBC. I'm King Major from TV.
And I'm David Peter from Zodiak.
I'm Malik Mera from
Robert Edward, Radio TV.
Julius, where are you everything?
Radio TV, Zodiak. I'm from the Department of Disaster Management Affairs.
Are we all done? Thank you very much. In front of you here, to my right, I have Mr. Wile Kambwandela, the Executive Director for Center for Social Accountability and Transparency. I also have Mr. To my far left, I have Mr. Yamigani Chokoto, who is the Regional Officer for the North. Next to him, to his right, is Mr. Alinafe Malunga, who is the Chief Investigations Officer. I am Arthur Semba, the Public Relations Officer, and with me here is the Honorable Ombudsman. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my singular honor to invite the Honorable Ombudsman to give a presentation because this is her show. Let's hear what the Honorable Ombudsman has for us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Arthur, and let me join you in welcoming you all to the Office of the Ombudsman for the release of our first report in a series of investigations concerning lack of transparency and accountability in the implementation of the Malawi's National Response COVID Plan. Before I do that, we thought it wise that we should also use this opportunity to give you an update of some of the investigations, other investigations that are going on in the office that the media houses have been very interested in following up. So I would not take much of your time, but first to give you an update on the investigations on allegations of mismanagement and abuse of development funds by the local councils. We started this investigation in October 2019, last year. Usually as an office, we don't take more than a year on an investigation, but you may all agree with me that this has been a very strange year with the COVID. It has really affected most of the operations within the office. But I'm happy to report that as of today, 90% of the information gathering has been done. What we are waiting for is to draft the report, and since there will be people who will be mentioned or who will be affected by the report itself or mentioned in a negative way, the next stage that we'll have to go through is to interface again with those particular people who are likely to be affected by the outcome of the investigation, just for purposes of fairness. So we are 90% complete with that investigation, and we are looking forward also on our part to finalizing it. The second one also was an investigation that we started in October again last year to do with allegations of acts of maladministration in the promotion of primary school and secondary school teachers. It was as a result of the promotions that were implemented by government in 2019 that we received a number of complaints from teachers across the country who claimed to have been discriminated against by government by that promotion, by those promotions. I'm happy to report that we have completed the report. All that is awaiting is the printing, and all things being equal, probably next week we should be able to release it. There's also an investigation that we started as a result of a complaint that was lodged by Mr. Ian Simboda versus Malawi Broadcasting Corporation. We finished the investigations. Again, we are simply at the stage of putting together the determination on that matter, and within the next 2 weeks, that determination should be out. We also, this year, in June, initiated an investigation on the allegations of acts of abuse of power by the Attorney General in the procurement of lawyers from South Africa for MEC. We started this investigation in June 2020 after receiving a complaint from Youth and Society, yes. Again, I'm happy to report that we completed the investigations. The report is also completed. It's going through the editing stage. So all things being equal, within the next few days, that report should also be out. The office has been swamped with a lot of and a number of complaints against complaints on irregularities, nepotism, tribalism, abuse of office. That has also been going on allegedly in a number of parastatals in this country. The first set of complaints that we received were from MACRA, MERA, Malawi Post Corporation, Tobacco Commission, Planter Water Board, and Rihako. We have worked so hard on these investigations, literally stopping some of the operations, especially in the regional offices, because most of the regional officers have had to be here for the past 3 weeks, helping the head office to work on these investigations. So I'm happy to report that for MACRA, MERA, Malawi Post Corporation, Tobacco Commission, Blantyre Water Board, Longo Handling Company, 80% of the work has been done, and the reports are in the process of being drafted. We are working so hard to make sure that before we close down, the usual government close down during Christmas time, we should be able to release these reports. Again, it is also our hope that the next set of complaints that we received after this is to do with the Central Medical Stores, NIF, MEDEF, the former MEDEF, and CFTC, Competition Fair Trading Commission. We also received complaints on that. Currently, it's the CMST and the NIF one that seem to be making a lot of progress. We are having the public inquiries next week for these two institutions. And again, we are working so hard. We are hoping that we'll be able to release the reports for these together with the first 6 before we close for Christmas, all things being equal. We are also receiving a lot of other complaints from other institutions. We have received similar complaints from ADL, from Teachers Union of Malawi. Those complaints that we've received after I think 10th of November, we are being very frank and open to the complainants, where they have reviewed themselves, because most of them are coming as a way of anonymous complaints, that substantive work on this investigation, in all fairness, will only start in next year in January, because everyone here is now involved in the other investigations. So that's a short update that I thought it's only fair and right that we should give on the other investigations that we are currently undertaking in this office. Now, coming back to the main agenda for today, let me just take you back to the timeline for COVID. If you remember, it was on 31st December that Republic of China announced to the world about a new coronavirus that was identified in the Wuhan province. It was on 30th of January when the World Health Organization declared the novel coronavirus outbreak as a public emergency of international concern. In turn, on 20th of March, the government of Malawi declared a state of disaster in the country due to the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic and its potential devastating effects. The then president, Professor Arthur Peter Mutharika, appointed a special cabinet committee on coronavirus to lead, support, and coordinate efforts against the COVID-19 pandemic. On 1st April 2020, Malawi recorded its first ever COVID-19 case in Area 9 Lilongwe. On 6th of May, the special committee that was set up by the president was replaced with a multi-stakeholder presidential task force committee consisting of cabinet members, healthy professionals, members of faith organizations, and political organizations. After that, a 3-month national COVID-19 preparedness and response plan was developed to guide the COVID-19 related activities for March to June 2020. Implementation of the plan is coordinated, facilitated and overseen by the Presidential Task Force, National Disaster Preparedness and Relief Committee, and the collaborative mechanism between DODME and the UN Resident Coordinator's Office. There are a total of 13 clusters composed of various public institutions which are implementing various activities under this plan. The plan is being funded by local and international and also public and private institutions. The funding is in form of cash and non-cash materials and is provided through DODMA account and Ministry of Finance Coronavirus Relief Response account, both held at FDH. As at 30th of June 2020, 75 billion 600 million had been mobilized against the requirement of 276 billion. Of the 75 billion that was mobilized, 11 billion is cash contributed by Malawi government, local and international organizations, some salary deductions from the former president and the vice president and former cabinet members. So how did we as an office come into this investigation? So I remember it was around April. I was in the field on prison inspection work. And it was also around the same time that some chunk of money had been released by government to the local councils as a matter of responding to the COVID-19. When I noted in one of the particular districts that I was, that there were some institutions at the local council level that had been left out from the funding. For example, prisons. So it was at the prison, so I had asked what's going on here. They had nothing. At the same time, it was at the time when we, as government institutions, were putting up measures in trying to ensure that we curb the spread of the pandemic. And in prisons, what they had done was to ban any visitation by relatives to their relations in the prisons. And that meant that the burden of providing all the necessities for the prisoners was left on the prison, which is already underfunded, and now with the pandemic needed even more resources. And this had some really dire consequences on the operations on prisons. I also went to a number of police formations where I also noted that they were also left out of the money that had gone to the council. So this got us thinking as an office that there was a need to look into the transparency and accountability of the funds that were being released. Otherwise, the very purpose of the plan was going to be defeated. And then whilst this was also going on, both conventional and the social media was awash with reports that some members of the cabinet and some members of parliament were being paid hefty allowances whenever they are conducting COVID-19 related activities. And sooner or later, there was a leakage of a video clip showing two former cabinet ministers belonging to the task force discussing calculations about subsistence and fuel allowances for a COVID-19 pandemic-related activity that they needed to carry out. The content of the video clip generated a big public outcry concerning how funds meant for the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic were being managed by the committee. The committee's response or efforts to clarify what was going on in the video clip were largely deemed inadequate by the public. So out of this, my office identified the following 4 key concerns from the public outcry. First, lack of transparency concerning terms and conditions of the Presidential Task Force COVID-19. Appearance of abuse of funds meant for the fight for COVID-19 pandemic by the leading coordinating and implementing agencies, lack of accountability by institutions and public officials, and inadequate monitoring mechanisms, and also ineffectiveness and responsiveness of the implementation of the response plan. So it was my office's position that if these things are left and not looked into, the very effectiveness of the plan itself could be rendered negatory. We could lose resources, and most importantly, we could also lose a lot of lives. And that's why we thought that we should intervene by way of investigating how the COVID funds under the COVID plan are being used. So it was supposed to be a real-time investigation where we investigate one cluster and then give our findings, and hoping that the findings and the recommendations would go into would feed into improving the system for the other clusters as the plan is being implemented. So that was our plan, and it still remains our plan regardless of the fact that we seem to have delayed a bit in this investigation. But nevertheless, all this falls under our mandate under Section 123 of the Constitution and Section 5 of the Ombudsman Act. So we started this investigation in June 2020, and as I've said, the plan is to do it in bits and bits. So I need to emphasize here that this report that we are releasing is only for the coordination cluster. And in the coordination cluster, there is DODMA and there's Office of the President and Cabinet. So this investigation has focused on these two institutions coming under the coordination cluster. The next report that will come out, for which we already have got the data, we just need to clean it up and come up with a report, will focus on the healthy security and the local councils cluster, and the final one will be a wrap-up of all the clusters. So I needed to emphasize that this is not the whole, this is not the full report of all the of the whole investigation and the plan. So some of the issues that we have flashed out within the coordination cluster was that there was an issue of having two separate accounts opened under Ministry of Finance, and the one that has always existed with DODMA. So you know, DODMA, by its very mandate, means that they have always had a government authorized bank account through which funds for national disasters are channeled through. This notwithstanding, we find that in March 2020, Ministry of Finance opened a coronavirus relief account, and it's through this account 6.3 billion was channeled. This 6.3 billion included the 6.2 billion that was donated by Reserve Bank of Malawi, which had previously been deposited into the DODMA account, but was later on withdrawn and deposited in the Ministry of Finance account on instructions from Ministry of Finance. In justifying this withdrawal of money from DODMA account, Ministry of Finance stated that they have authority. They did this because they've got authority over all public funds. However, when we look at Section 2 of the Public Finance Management Act, all the other money that was in DODMA qualified as public money. So we find it a bit suspect that there was a specific and isolated interest in the 6.2 billion that was donated by Reserve Bank. Moreover, we find that under Section 3 of the Public Finance Management Act, the Secretary of Treasury is empowered to play an oversight role over all accounts that have got public money. So considering this legal mandate, the Secretary of Treasury has over public money and public accounts, the opening of a separate account under Ministry of Finance for receipt of COVID-19 donations, we find it was unnecessary and unjustified. All the Ministry of Finance needed to do was to provide the oversight over the DODMA account. And it should be mentioned that the very presence of the two accounts ended up defeating the responsiveness of the plan itself. There was a situation that arose in July 2020. concerning the health workers at Kameza Isolation Center who conducted a strike and downed their tools as a result of non-payment of their allowance, which resulted in the closure of the center. Dodma failed to honor a financial request by Blantyre City Council, citing that they had no funds. But when we were doing the investigation, Minister of Finance told us that at this particular time, they had money in their account. But still, even with that money, Kameza Isolation Center ended up being closed. Thus, it is our finding that the opening of this account created unnecessary responsibility that only promoted confusion concerning coordination between Minister of Finance and Dodma, thereby undermining the responsiveness of the response plan itself. For us, we find this as maladministration. Now, to remedy this, we are directing that Minister of Finance should close the COVID-19 relief and response account at FDH because it is basically redundant. And all the donations related to disaster should henceforth be deposited into the account managed by Dodma. And the Secretary to the Treasury should simply provide oversight in accordance with the Public Finance Management Act. In addition, in the spirit of transparency and accountability, we are also directing that Dodma should publish 2 times during the week and weekend using radio, newspapers, or cash and kind donations which they have received from March to July 2020 and how the same have been disbursed and utilized. We are directing that this should be done by 30th of January 2021. All the donations that were received after July 2020 should be published equally using radio and newspaper every quarter until the disaster declaration is lifted. Now, there was also the issue of the 6.2 billion Kwacha Reserve Bank donation. As stated above, Reserve Bank made a donation of 6.2 billion through Dodma. In its submission, the bank that it decided to contribute 6.2 billion as part of the bank's corporate social responsibility and to mitigate the pandemic on the bank's mandate of price stability. When we invited bank's officials here for verification exercise, they said that the price stability mandate is derived from sections 4 and 28 of the Reserve Bank of Malawi Act. And they elaborated that the tools for price stability under the law are bank policy rate, liquidity reserve requirement, ratio, discount window facilities, purchase and sale of the exchange, purchase and sale of securities, for example, treasury bills, purchase agreements and reserve purchase agreements, and bailouts of ailing enterprises, including banks. Moreover, the bank also asserted that in normal circumstances, donations like these ones of 6.2 billion are guided by the corporate social responsibility policy budget and are made through the gifts and donations account. However, in this instance, contrary to its own policy, the donation was made through the governance office. And they said this was particularly in light of the unprecedented crisis. Now, I should say that as an office, we found it quite astounding that a central bank like Reserve Bank could breach its own law in such a flagrant manner and release such huge amount of money without a proper and deeper discussion within the office. Because even when we ask for more documentation and to justification, why are we departing from the conventional tool to donation, they could not give us enough documentation justifying that. However, we need to mention that we found that during the discussion with Dodma, they had stated that during one of their discussions with government and the donor community, it was resolved that there should be social cash transfer, cushioning urban people in Lilongwe, Blantyre, Nzuzu, and Zomba against the effects of the pandemic in view of an impending lockdown. As such, a 4-month budget cash transfer program was endorsed by the development partners and government with a budget of the social cash transfer pegged at 6.1 billion per month. The development partners undertook to contribute 3 months worth of support on the condition that government commits to fund the remaining budget of 1 month. This was the same time that the 6.2 billion donation was made by Reserve Bank. However, we all know the lockdown was not effected as a result of the court injunction. However, this coincidence in the timing of the donation and these discussions by Roman partners and Dodma is not lost on us, and we find it to be quite incredible. And I think it left us with no other option but to kind of believe that maybe the decisions about these donations were being made somewhere, and that the bank was being used to rubber stamp a decision that had already been made somewhere. Moreover, we both know the socio-political environment of that time, where we were going towards the fresh presidential elections, and how such disbursement of social cash transfer could result in some sort of political mileage for government of the day. But all in all, we find that the bank acted illegally by departing from the conventional tools for price stability as provided for in the Reserve Bank of Malawi Act and opting for donation. This was maladministration. And again, categorizing a huge donation like this of 6.2 billion kwacha and channeling it through the governance account, which is at the sole discretion of the governor, is contrary to principles of good corporate governance. And for us, it's a maladministration. Now, considering all the surrounding circumstances over this issue, the only remedy we could come up with was to recommend that the Reserve Bank should put in place mechanisms that shall enable it to desist from breaking its own law should a similar situation arise in the future. Now, coming to the issue of the allowances for the Presidential Task Force. As I've said, on 16th of May 2020, the former president, Professor Arthur Peter Mutharika, replaced the Special Committee on Coronavirus with a multi-stakeholder Presidential Task Force of Cabinet Ministers, health professionals, members of faith organizations, and members of political organizations. In a memo dated 12 May by the Principal Secretary Administration to the Chief Secretary, as a position was called then, a recommendation was made that for purposes of allowances, the task force members should be treated like a commission of inquiry that are appointed by the President from time to time. Accordingly, members of the task force were entitled to allowances like TNT for those that were not in public service, and this was around 414 kwacha per kilometer. And the professional allowances, so the chairperson was entitled to 50,000 kwacha. Every member was entitled to 45,000, and the secretariat members were entitled to 30,000. In terms of airtime, the chairperson was entitled to 40,000 kwacha, and every member was entitled to 20,000, and secretariat 15,000. You get full details of the other allowances when you get the report, but I just thought I should highlight those because they form the bulk of the expenses of the Presidential Task Force. So such that, as I've said, the Presidential Task Force was meeting every week, and every week a Presidential Task Force meeting was costing 2 million on average. So it could be 2.1, 2.2, 2.4, but on average it was 2 million. And the bulk of these expenses were professional allowance and telephone allowance. Now, when you look at the Commission of Inquiry Act, the powers of a Commission of Inquiry are equated to the powers of the High Court. And so members of a Commission of Inquiry can summon witnesses, call for production of books, examine witness and parties concerned under oath. So obviously, it's easy to see that the Presidential Task Force is totally different, and we could even argue that its work is quite less demanding than that of a Commission of Inquiry, such that their allowances cannot be equated. And although it can be argued that having different regime of allowances could be an administrative nightmare, we believe that the balance of common sense and fiscal prudence weighs more on having separate sets of allowances regime for task forces like these ones. When you have a closer look at the allowances, especially telephone and professional allowance, we also find them to be quite unjustifiable, because these guys were meeting every week. So you wonder who they were calling if they are meeting to justify the telephone allowances. As for professional allowances, most of them, especially those from the public sector, from public service rather, they were simply doing this in a normal day, doing their normal duty, and meaning that they were already earning a salary. And so we found as a principle here that these allowances were quite unjustified. But even if it could be argued that there was still need for some sort of a compensation for the work that they were doing on the presidential task force, we find that these figures were too high, all factors considered. Based on the above, therefore, it is our finding that the decision by the Office of the President and Cabinet to equate the task force to a commission of inquiry and the failure to come up with specific allowances and honorarium regime for ad hoc task forces such as this one, it reflects administrative laxity and total indifference to prudent use of public funds, and for us, it's maladministration. To this end, and to remedy this, we are directing that the Office of the President and Cabinet should develop a separate policy guidelines for an allowance regime for task forces such as the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19, and the entitlements should be commensurate with the service that they actually provide and should be reasonable, taking into account the economy of the country. We are directing that this should be done by the end of the 2020-2021 financial year. Now, when we were discussing with the OPC, they informed us that as a result of a public outcry of the allowances being drawn by the task force in July 2020, the task force vice chairperson verbally and quietly suspended the drawing of the allowances for the task force. Now, Section 2 of the Constitution makes an open, accountable, and transparent government as well as informed democratic choice as part of the fundamental principles that sustain the trust of the people of Malawi and gives authority to exercise powers of the state. Section 15(1) of the Constitution of the Republic of Malawi requires all organs of government and its agencies to respect, protect, and uphold human rights and freedoms in Chapter 4. Section 37 states that every person shall have a right of access to all information held by the state or any of its organs. What this means is that transparency and accountability are a matter of obligation on the part of the government and a matter of human rights for its citizens. So we find that the verbal and quiet suspension of the allowances that were being paid to the task force members is contrary to the spirit of Section 43 of the Constitution and the principle of transparency. Government positions like these are supposed to be in writing. Otherwise, the vacuum can be exploited. Therefore, we find this omission to be writing as a maladministration. And as a remedy, it is directed that the co-chairperson of the task force should put in writing the suspension of the payment of the allowances, including reasons behind the suspension, and such communication should be made public to satisfy the public's legitimate interest to know the settlements of the task force. This should be done by 20th of December 2020. A large part of the activities that were done by the coordination cluster were to do with the receiving of the detainees and the detainees, especially from South Africa. So during the period under review, Malawi received 5,012 retainees and detainees who came in staggered manner. So the receipt of the detainees would involve Department of Immigration, MRA, police, DHOs, media houses, MDF, Public Health Institute of Malawi. What is striking is that from our analysis of the documentation that was presented to us, what was striking was that all the officers from these institutions were paid full subsistence allowances for 3 or 4 days, when most of them, their assignments would only be required for a day or 2. Furthermore, even the senior officers, and these include directors, the PSs, who probably would simply go and do a supervisory role or just to check that things are right, would be paid also allowances for the whole period. And out of this, because for example, if say we are receiving returnees from South Africa, really after the immigration has processed their passports or whatever travel documents they have, you would think that's it for immigration. After the people disinfecting Narikukule College have done the disinfection, you would expect that is it. But you find that all of the officers involved in that particular activity would be paid the full allowance for the whole period. And therefore, it is our finding that the payment of DSA, the allowances to government officials not directly involved in the processing of the returnees for the same number of days as for those directly involved, is not only unreasonable, but abuse of the funds. And we find that this is maladministration. Now, related to this, we find that on some occasions, officers who were paid a full DSA were also incurring meal charges at hotels paid by public funds, just like those who were on full board. So you would have some officers who are on full board, they are working, they are staying, say, at Mount Soch Hotel, that you find that amongst the same group, there are officers who receive their DSA, but they would go into the hotel and also eat meals paid by the public funds. We established evidence of such costs being incurred at Mount Soch Hotel. Further to this, even the officers who were on full board, we find that because there was no ceiling put to the cost of meals that they could take and whatever, you find that they exploited this. And we have evidence of an officer who spent like 45,000 on one dinner. A dinner that included really some expensive stuff. And this is an officer who is there to help receiving returnees and detainees from South Africa. And even when we were interacting with this officer, he even admitted that he was extravagant. But then at the end of the day, it was public funds that was used to settle this bill. Again, we found evidence of payment of allowances that were totally outside government policy regimes. An officer who, by government policy, was entitled to 5,500 as incidental allowance was being paid 10,000 per day without any basis at all, and without the system actually noticing that, but he was paid. And then there was also a practice during some meetings, especially the coordination meetings, of officers who had been fully paid DSA and therefore not entitled to lunch allowance, being given lunch with a justification that it was a matter of convenience. And this is what happened at a National Coordinating Committee meeting that took place in Mponela from 9th to 11th January 2020. 9th to 11th July 2020. All the officers who went to those meetings had been paid their full DSA, but at the same time, a lunch was also provided to them on public funds. And for us, we find the justification of convenience not making sense at all, because for those of you, most of us have been to Mponela, you are doing these meetings at a hotel, you just order your meal and you pay right there at the hotel. So the justification of convenience does not make sense. But even if you wanted a meal, then don't pay the DSA in the first place. Now, all this speaks of exploitation of public funds, and it is a serious maladministration that we have found. Now, to remedy this, we are directing that all these officers who were at Mponela meeting and were given lunch after being paid full DSA should repay that money into the Dodma account. The officer who had lunch at Mount Sosh Hotel should also pay back that money into Dodma account. An officer who was overpaid incidental allowances should also repay that money into the Dodma account. All these payments should be done by 20th December 2020. Irregular purchasing and handling of goods. We also made a finding that some goods that were purchased by Dodma were, all factors considered, highly overpriced. For example, we found evidence of a purchase by Dodma of Butex soap, a large chunk of Butex soap of undisclosed size. So on the receipt there was no size of disclosed of that tablet of soap, but they are buying it at almost 1,000 kwacha per tablet. Now we all know that the price of the bigger size of Butex on the shops is about 450. Now all factors considered, the price could not have been increased by 100%. But this is what happened, and public funds were used to pay for those. It is their finding that paying for goods with obviously inflated prices and even liquidating such goods without questioning responsible individuals or seeking any clarification does not only demonstrate lack of due diligence, but is unacceptable, negligent, and even akin to fraud. This was maladministration. Again, there were some suspicious purchase of goods that we also noted during our investigations. Specific to mention was a REF General Dealers Receipt number 153 dated 17th June 2020, which we found to have been issued both in Zomba and Machinga and with similar type of goods. The supplier, that is REF General Dealers, admitted to have supplied the goods to Zomba DHO, but denied to have supplied Machinga DHO any of the goods that were indicated there. And Machinga DHO as well denied to have received any money from Dodma, nor to have received the stated goods on the receipt. However, this money was paid out by Dodma, and that means that about $500,000 is unaccounted for. For us, this is akin to fraud, and it is maladministration. And on this specific one, we are directing a criminal investigation on this particular officer, and also some administrative processes to be done by Dodma, especially on the officer who drew this money. Now, ultimately, when you look at this picture that we are drawing, what is clearly coming out from our investigation of the coordination cluster is that allowances were high on the agenda in all its activities. Our calculations show that about 322,659,196 was allocated to the coordination cluster. Out of this money, 79.8% was spent on allowances. So these are in form of professional, telephone, TNT, DSS, lunches, which were abused as I've described above. I think for any right-thinking Malawian, this picture should be a point of worry. If at least half of the money could be seen to have been used for the actual activities and provision of services for the actual COVID-19 fight, it would have been some point of solace. Our priorities were totally misplaced, and that is why our title for the report is Misplaced Priorities. And that is why, as I'm wrapping up, we are recommending that Office of the President and Cabinet should comprehensively review the government allowances policies by making them more realistic, considerate to the country's economy, more firmed up, and more clarified so that they are not subjected to the abuses that we have seen during this investigation. And this should be done by the end of the 2020-2021 financial year. So in closing, let me once again extend my sincere gratitude to all government institutions involved in this investigation, DODMA, Ministry of Finance, OPC. They were very cooperative during the whole investigations. And a special thanks should also go to OSISA, who funded this investigation and are continuing to fund, and also to EU for providing the funds for printing of this report. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Honorable Ombudsman. Members of the press, ladies and gentlemen, from what the Ombudsman has presented, we can all appreciate that her focus was on the coordination cluster. We are here at our midst with Mr. Nkhani from DODMA, which was a primary respondent to this investigation, just to give us some few remarks, because courtesy demands that the respondent also gives us a few remarks. Mr. Nkhani.
Honorable Ombudsman and all the officers from the Office of the Ombudsman and the press, thank you very much. I think in my brief remarks, let me start by thanking the Office of the Ombudsman for the work that they have done. Why I'm thinking is because I think the investigation was done at an opportune time while we are still in the process implementing the COVID-19 response plan, so that the findings, the lessons learned, the recommendations can actually be utilized in the remaining part of the implementation of the plan. So, having said that, I would like to say that as a coordinating body, DODMA, who get the report and then study it, understand it, and then especially concentrate on the recommendations, and then we commit that we are going to adhere to all the recommendations, even as we proceed with the implementation of the plan. And also maybe not just the COVID-19 plan, but also some of the recommendations that I had, they even apply for the other transaction of all public funds, including maybe the other transaction funds. The recommendation will help us to improve in the areas which have been identified as being maladministration. So in a brief, in a nutshell, let me say that the department is committing itself to make sure that we implement and adhere to all the recommendations. Thank you very much, Honorable. Thank you, the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nkhani, for your remarks. Right now, we are inviting members of the press to give to ask just a few questions. So what we're going to do is to have the questions in sets of 3, and you start by introducing yourself and the media house that you are representing. Thank you very much. Or you want one-on-one? All right. It makes... all right. It makes the job of the Ombudsman easier. So So maybe we might draw this to a close so that the media can have one-on-one interviews with Honorable Ombudsman. May I request Temo as well to give us a closing prayer. Thank you very much.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you have honored our request when we had asked that you start with us and finish with us. And we thank you that the Honorable Ombudsman has delivered the report successfully, Lord. And we thank you that this report is meant to improve the welfare of Malawians. So may it serve its purpose, Lord. In the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.
We have the copies of the reports that we prepared that we give